Alright, welcome to Neurotutorials. This is the first of a series in tutorials ranging from embryology, anatomy, physiology, pathology, and pharmacology. This video is the introduction to neuroanatomy. Now, the topics I'll be talking about today will be expanded upon in other videos, in other neuroanatomy videos. So, what's the purpose of the nervous system? It's the apparatus that allows us to control voluntary and involuntary functions such as moving and breathing, respectively. It allows us to experience our environment, to see a beautiful sunset, or hear music and smell a bouquet of roses and experience touch. So you may be asking yourself, how are we able to experience all these amazing things? Well, we have our brains to think, and there are two important components of the nervous system in our brain, neurons and glial cells. So let's start off with the neuron. So what are the components of a neuron? The two important parts we'll talk about are axons and dendrites. So I'll draw a neural cell here. Now the first thing we're going to talk about are axons, which are long extensions coming off a neuron, and they transmit electrical impulses called action potentials from the neuron cell body to other neurons. So this is a axon, and it's sending its signal to another neuron here via the action potentials. Now, the other part of the neuron is the dendrite, and dendrites are short, stubby structures coming off the cell body that receive electrical information traveling along axons. So there'll be short, kind of stubby structures coming off like that, and we'll give this one 1 since it's communicating with that cell. And there are several types of neurons that we should briefly discuss. And the first, let me just erase this. The first type of neuron is the unipolar neuron. And this neuron receives electrical impulses called the action potentials via dendrites and sends action potentials away from the neuron via axons. And these neurons are important for movement. So similar to what I just drew out for you, the neuron will send electrical impulses away from its cell body via the axons, and it will receive information via the dendrites. It will receive the action potentials. So then we have the pseudo-unipolar neuron. So I'll draw it here. And the interesting thing about this pseudo-unipolar neuron is that just like the unipolar neuron, it receives impulses via dendrites, but its axons can also transmit action potentials back to the cell body. So I'll show you. Its axons kind of split into two, like that. So these neurons are typically involved in sensation. The action potentials that travel back to the cell via the axon come from special types of receptors. Some allow us to feel heat and cold and pain and light touch. So, this receptor will be somewhere maybe in your epidermis, in your skin, and it might sense, some kind of heat or cold. So that will be the stimulus to the receptor, and then it will transmit a signal back to the cell body of the axon, and to the cell body of the neuron, and then that signal will be sent back to the nervous system, the central nervous system, to be interpreted as whatever the original stimulus was. And finally, there is the bipolar neuron. It's also called an interneuron. It has two axonal projections from its cell body, and it acts as a connector between other neurons. So your bipolar neuron will look something like this. Now you may be thinking this looks kind of like the pseudo-unipolar neuron, but it's actually a lot different. The pseudo-unipolar neurons are usually considered part of this involved in sensation and sensory, and bipolar neurons are neither sensory or motor. They're kind of just the conduits in between two different neurons. And the axons, so that's it for the different types of neurons. So the axons of neurons are bundled together into structures called nerves. So you've probably heard of nerves before. You know that they transmit senses. So typically what a nerve would look like is kind of like this bundle here, and these would be, let's say this is a nerve, what they call a nerve fascicle, and these would be all the little axons from neurons, and they're bundled together, and that's a nerve. And certain nerves are what's called myelinated. So they have a protective sheath and a sheath that also kind of acts as an insulation to help the nerve impulses travel faster. So then the next question is, now that we've talked about neurons, is what are glial cells? And glial cells are like the support system of the nervous system, the support cells of the nervous system. They assist neurons in their functions and also provide structural support. And these are the cells that make the myelin that I was just mentioning. So an example is in the central nervous system, we have oligodendrocytes, and those create the myelin covering for nerves or for neurons. And in the peripheral nervous system, we'll have Schwann cells, which will also provide myelination, but this is specifically for the peripheral nervous system or the nerves that come off the spinal cord. So we'll get more into the function of glial cells in other tutorials. I won't go into too much detail here. So now that we know about neurons and glial cells, which are the basic constituents of the nervous system, we can move a level up and start talking about the structures they make. And there are several different ways to divide the nervous system, but let's focus on the division I just talked about of central versus peripheral. Now the central nervous system includes the brain and the brainstem. So the brain and the brainstem. And the peripheral nervous system is composed of the 31 pairs of peripheral nerves that come off the spinal cord and the 12 cranial nerves that come off the brainstem. So if I was to just continue this drawing here of the spinal cord, then you have certain nerves coming off. You have 31 pairs of these, and again, those are the peripheral nerves. And then you have certain nerves that come off the brain and the brainstem, which are called your cranial nerves. And that's another topic that I'll get into. It's actually a very interesting topic. So what are the components of the brain? And I'll start getting to that. Well, they include the cerebral cortex, the brainstem, the basal ganglia and cerebellum, thalamus and hypothalamus, and the limbic system. So I know that's a lot to take in, but I'll explain each one of those for you right now. So we can see that grossly, as a whole, that the brain has lots of kind of wrinkles and folds here. And these are called gyri and sulci, and they increase the surface area and allow the brain to hold a lot of neurons. The brain is covered also by several protective sheaths called meninges, and the best way to picture it is to think of the brain as having been laminated several times, and each of these layers of lamination has a name. So the layer that's closest to the brain is the pia mater. So it's kind of be like this. It'd be very, very close to the brain, like this. And between the brain and the pia is cerebrospinal fluid, also known as CSF, and that nourishes the brain. So it's kind of like this fluid that's circulating around the brain and the spinal cord, for that matter. So that's cerebrospinal fluid. And the brain actually has several cavities deep to the surface that we're seeing here. They're called ventricles. And the cerebrospinal fluid can go in and travel through the ventricles and then travel back out and kind of just circulate everywhere around the brain. Um, and so I'll get back to now talking about the rest of the meninges. So let me label this actually here. So this is the pia mater. So next we'll talk about the arachnoid mater. And normally the arachnoid and the pia are tightly fused to each other, so this is called kind of a potential space. However, in some instances, such as brain bleeds, the tight fusion between these layers can be separated and have really disastrous consequences. So then I'll draw here now the arachnoid, which is very, very, very tightly associated with the pia here. And as I just said, maybe there'll be a bleed, and so that layer gets separated, and then blood will start to accumulate there. But that layer is called the arachnoid. And it gets that name because if you were to look at it on a cadaver or look at a preserved brain, you would see that it's kind of like this spider web-like appearance. So the last covering of the brain is the dura mater, and that attaches to the skull. And if you were doing a medical examination of someone who was dead, or and you were to take a segment of their skull to drill into it, or to take the whole skull cap off, you wouldn't see the gyri and the sulci that I'm showing you right here. You would see the dura mater, which is kind of just the last covering, and it's attached to the skull, and it would kind of be just covering the entire brain. Each of these layers covers the brain. I'm kind of just showing the cross section, but if you were to look at the growth structure, it would be the kind of this big sheath, and it would be connected to the skull. Okay, so back to the brain. So you might have noticed there's this word up here, cerebral cortex. So I'm going to start talking about the cerebral cortex. So the outer portion you see here with the gyri and sulci that I mentioned is called the cerebral cortex, which is the seat of our consciousness. It contains neurons involved in interpreting special senses and executing movement, among other things. And the brain has several different lobes, each with its own segment of cortex. And the lobes are classified by their function. So the first one I'll talk about, oh, and before I forget, there's a very important landmark here on the brain called the central sulcus, and that kind of allows us to divide or give us a reference point for certain ways of thinking of or dividing the nervous system. And so now the first thing I'll talk about is the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is this portion here. And this segment contains neurons involved in attention, reward, and planning, among other things. And this is also where our executive function lies. And the executive function is the ability to recognize the consequences of our actions and to act accordingly. And it's it's the part of the brain that allows you to say, okay, I've had enough, when you're midway through eating an entire bag of potato chips. So that's the frontal lobe. And the next would be the parietal lobe. So I'll draw that in another color. The parietal lobe here. The parietal lobe, this segment contains neurons involved in or the parietal cortex. This segment contains neurons involved in processing sensory information like touch and hearing, and it's also involved in spatial awareness. So later on in this tutorial series, we'll see that there's some pretty interesting pathology that can arise from damage to this structure, such as like not being able to recognize one half of your whole visual world. Now we'll talk about the temporal cortex. And the temporal cortex allows us to interpret and ascribe meaning to visual and auditory information. So I'll draw that here. And it's also important in memory and the processing of language. And so you're using your temporal lobe right now to understand and interpret what I'm telling you. And you're also creating visual memories of what you're currently seeing on the screen. Finally is the occipital lobe. And as you might guess, it's right here. The occipital lobe or the occipital cortex is involved in processing visual information. It allows us to interpret visual information that comes from our eyes. So the next structures I'll talk about are the basal ganglia and cerebellum. Now, these are going to be kind of hard for me to draw here on this, but the well, at least the basal ganglia, and cerebellum. So these are the parts of the brain that are involved in fine-tuning our conscious movement. The basal ganglia aids us in making voluntary and wanted movements. So, and it's kind of deep to the brain here. It's just a collection of nerve cells, and it again, it allows us to control our conscious movements. The cerebellum, which you can probably see right here, the cerebellum helps in our coordination and balance. This fine-tuning of movement is obtained by arranging inhibitory and excitatory neurons in various patterns. So that is true for the basal ganglia and for the cerebellum. And you may not have heard of the basal ganglia before, but it's a structure that is involved in people who have Parkinson's disease. And since I said that kind of makes sense, since I said that it's involved in voluntary and conscious movement. The next things we'll talk about are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And again, I'll draw them here. You can't really see them looking in this particular view of the brain, but I'll draw them over top of it and I'll explain the function. So the thalamus is kind of right here. And the thalamus is sort of like a toll booth between the structures of the brain and the rest of the body. Most all of the signals coming from or going to the cortex have to pass through this toll booth to reach their destination. So an example is, let's say we take this strip of the brain here, which is known as the motor cortex, and we have a neuron here in the motor cortex, and we want to send it the message to our hand to move. So it would first have to descend and send action potential to a neuron in the thalamus here, and that nerve or that cell would then send a signal through the spinal cord, and then then it would send it to the muscle that we're trying to move. It would send a signal to the muscle we're trying to move here. So it has to travel through the thalamus. And also, accordingly, if you were to sense something in your environment, such as a pinprick, then that information will travel through the receptor of a neuron, a pseudo-unipolar neuron, as I was talking about earlier, and it will go through the spinal cord, and it will have to pass through the thalamus before it then goes to the sensory cortex, which is opposite of the motor cortex here. So these are topics that I'll get into a little bit more detail in subsequent videos, specifically talking about how sensory and motor systems work. So the next thing we'll talk about is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, let me redraw the thalamus here. The thalamus is kind of here, so then the hypothalamus is somewhat below it, and that's why it's called the hypothalamus, because hypo means below. So this structure, so let me label here, hypothalamus. Thalamus. The hypothalamus is a structure that controls functions, or it really controls drives like hunger and thirst and sex. It also controls the sympathetic nervous system, which it controls the fight or flight response, which I'm sure you've heard of. And then there's also the limbic system. So the limbic system is involved in emotion, smell, and other structures involved in memory, and it contains other structures involved in memory. The memory component is in part due to the hippocampus, which you might have heard of before. But the limbic system, again, is a structure. It's deep to the surface of the brain we're seeing here, and it contains a couple of different structures like the amygdala and the hippocampus, and I'll go into more detail with that in subsequent videos. Finally, there is the brainstem. Now, the brainstem has three parts to it: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So I will draw them here. The midbrain is kind of located up this way. By the way, this entire structure here is the brainstem. So this would be the midbrain. This would be the pons, and this portion here would be the medulla. Each segment contains clusters of neurons called nuclei that exit the brainstem as nerves and perform special functions from vision to smell and facial movements. And these nerves are called cranial nerves. And again, this is another topic I can't really do justice in this video, but I will talk about more later. The brainstem continues to become the spinal cord and gives off peripheral or spinal nerves, as I mentioned and showed to you earlier. One interesting fact that I'll put in before I'll close is that the medulla controls a lot of our involuntary functions, the functions that we don't think about, that we just do, like breathing. And it receives information from our bloodstream about in our lungs about oxygen content and pH, and it adjusts our breathing rates and our heart rates and things like that automatically. So this brings us to the end of the introductory video to the nervous system anatomy, and I hope you found this tutorial useful. Feel free to leave comments and questions, and thanks for joining me, and I'll catch you on the flip side.